They have roadways. They have access to electricity. Even in the outposts, you could read in yesterday's New York Times, they're using Facebook and Skyping their families. But in Afghanistan, 3% of the population has access to the internet. And of that number, probably 95% are U.S. military or U.S. security contractors or U.S. NGOs. And when I was living in Kabul, it's maddening. The electricity is sporadic. If you don't have a backup generator, it would be impossible to run a factory or to have any kind of activity that's at all dependent on electricity. And this is after the United States has been occupying that country for 10 years. Even in the relatively calm places, there's no access to electricity yet. When I was in Iraq, every single electrical station was destroyed by the 1991 United States Desert Storm bombing. And I watched with my own eyes how Saddam Hussein's people cobbled together whatever they could get in 6 months. The electricity was working again in Baghdad and in many of the other places that were loyal to Saddam Hussein. If you weren't loyal to Saddam Hussein, you didn't get electricity. People must be wondering in Afghanistan, what do you have to do to get electricity? So the cost of the war is extremely high. The benefits, I think, are experienced much more by the companies producing weapons or by the groups sometimes referred to as Beltway bandits outside of Washington, D.C., NGOs that invest money in Afghanistan and it comes back into their own pockets. Sometimes even 70 to 80% of the money that they have to spend goes back to salaries for their workers and to maintenance of their own NGOs. And so people have a right to start to feel angry. I listened to these young boys, Saifullah, Ismatullah, and Adidullah, and honestly I wasn't hearing so much along the line of anger. But I could tell you that Adidullah, who was so poor that he went out on the mountainside every morning to try to scavenge and see if he couldn't get materials that he could bring back and sell in the marketplace. And he saw a real prize. It was a landmine. And he took the risk of opening it up to get the precious brass inside. It exploded and it ripped off 4 fingers from his hand and took out one of his eyes. And the other boys, this was in the springtime, they would get up with their crutches and their prostheses, and they'd help one another to make it out to the grassy area and put a sheet down. And they'd sit on the sheet, and they'd even joke with each other, even though some were Hazaras and some Pashtuns and some Uzbeks and some Tajiks, and they don't usually interact all that much. These boys were becoming friends, but Adidullah, he never left the ward. I think he just found it so hard to adjust to the idea of being eyeless in one eye and his hand ruined, and he was in a deep depression. So this also is part of the cost of war, and when you talk to the veterans who return to Champaign or other parts where you're connected with veterans, they will speak also of a tremendous cost that the war has exacted from them. Well, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the group that has given me a great deal of hope in this whole context, and that is the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. And these are young boys who live in the Bamiyan province. It's in the center area of Afghanistan. And they welcomed us very much in October to come to their homes. And so we stayed with them and their families, and we were really quite lucky. You can see Bamiyan right there in the center, just above where it says Jalrez Valley. And most of the fighting is happening in Helmand and Kandahar, and in the more eastern provinces of Nangarhar and Paktia. So Bamiyan is relatively calm now. It wasn't 10 years ago. These are young boys whom we met whose families have extremely painful memories of having been forced to evacuate. Young Abdullah's father was killed by the Taliban when Abdullah was just a small lad, and his whole family had to run from the Taliban in the middle of winter, and when the snows were high and the mountain roads were icy. And as I met with his mother and his sisters and his aunts, they talked about how hard it was when they were trying to go along those mountain paths. Some of the elderly people and children fell down the mountainside, and they couldn't go and retrieve them on an icy, snowy night. And Zakarullah, whom we were so fond of, he also had lost his uncle. The Taliban shot the uncle in front of the family. Zakarullah gets up 2 mornings a week at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he gets on a donkey and he rides 6 hours to go out and collect twigs and scrub brush on the mountainside so that he can bring that back and stack it up on the family roof. He lives in a very simple mud dwelling, so that in the winter months they'll have some kind of fuel to burn. And he's a very hardworking youngster. When he isn't going out to collect the scrub and the twigs, he's getting water, and then he gives that to other families nearby and earns a little bit of income. And what he really wants to do is try to learn English. And he realized he wasn't doing so well in school. He was in 7th grade and thinking he needed to brush up a little bit better. He placed himself back into the 2nd grade. So this teacher's heart was won over by Zakarullah. You see the women that are sitting at a meal on the floor, and to the furthest, closest to me, is the mother of Abdullah and Lolo Jan and their brother Hamid Jan. And up close, I had guessed that she was about 62 years old. She's 38. The women have a very, very hard life, and their lives are lives of servitude. Once they put on the hijab, the women then have to serve their brothers and fathers until they might become married, and once their sons reach puberty, then they're expected to serve the sons. It was hard for me to imagine how such a system could persist, and then I remembered being in the Pekin prison here in Illinois, not so far from here. And you know, those minimum security camps for women are generally very close to maximum security prisons for men. And the prisons in the United States don't want the men to be out near the perimeter of the prison because they have such long sentences. The median sentence length can be 27 years. They don't want the men to jump the fence or to take their luck going beyond the prison border. So they tend to develop prison camps where women will be very experienced in doing all of the maintenance things such as heating and air conditioning and dock work and distributing goods throughout the prisons and raking the leaves and shoveling the snow. And they don't want to be training new crews all the time. So this seems to argue for getting women there who